Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be focusing on the art of psychotherapy. With me is Dr. Irvin Yalom, a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University. Dr. Yalom is the author of numerous books on psychotherapy, including Existential Psychotherapy, the theory and practice of group psychotherapy. Every Day Gets a Little Closer, a twice-told therapy, a novel called When Nietzsche Wept, and Love's Executioner. Welcome, Irvin.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Your approach to psychotherapy is somewhat unique in the sense that you're willing to be controversial and innovative, trying to strike a balance, I think, between rigid orthodoxy in psychotherapy and those who, on the other hand, value innovation for its own sake. One of the areas that people have commented most, I think, about your work has to do with your willingness to interject your own personality into your therapy and often your own vulnerabilities. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, you know, I think that certainly as I've aged or perhaps matured as a therapist, I've been more willing to show more of my uncertainty to the patient. You know, I think that being uncertain is a large part of psychotherapy. It's a large part of life, and it's something that is quite uncomfortable for us therapists, and that many therapists really, I think, involve themselves sometimes in a carefully structured educational therapeutic program, and almost as a way of perhaps avoiding facing, dealing with, acknowledging some of the uncertainty that comes with the therapeutic venture. So perhaps some of the things that I've been willing to express and to acknowledge the patient have got to do with my own not knowing, or my own willingness to work with the patient, struggle with the patient, to sort of for us to be allies together in the therapeutic venture.
I'm interested in the term allies. I know in one of the case histories you wrote about, you used the term that was very important for you to treat your client as an equal, which seems in some ways to contradict the idea of a doctor and a patient. It's not usually an equal relationship, and yet the idea of an equal partnership does seem important as part of a therapeutic alliance.
Yeah, equal in that we're both exploring together. That it's, you know, I don't have a sense that I have a tremendous leap ahead of the patient in terms of what I know about where the patient has to go and what the patient has to discover. I think things work much better if there's a certain sense of spontaneity, the wonder of us both discovering and exploring something together. And I think in the same way, perhaps, I think that perhaps self-revelation on the part of the therapist has been quite important. And one of the things that I feel I've been willing to do with patients is to engage in more of my own sort of feelings. There was a book that I wrote called Every Day Gets a Little Closer, in which both the patient and I wrote summaries of each therapeutic session. It was a patient who was stuck in therapy and also was a good writer, a very good writer, but had a writing block. So as a way of helping her get past the writing block, I suggested that she write a summary of each of the sessions that we had, and I promised to do the same. And then every few months we exchanged summaries. So she read mine, I read hers, and that was also an exercise in self-disclosure, and it was a way to help her break through some of the idealized images that she had of me. after we did this for a period of time, a year and a half, and I think things worked very well in therapy, it seemed to me, as I used these notes with my students, that perhaps they might read almost like an epistolary novel. So we published them together, and it's very interesting to take a look at the differences in perception the patient has of an hour and you have of an hour. It's a kind of a Rashomon experience. All the things that I value in the hour, these elegant interpretations I made, I learned that she never really heard them. And the things that she valued were the rather subtle, delicate, personal things that went on between us that I hardly even registered.
Yeah. Well, one of the main issues in therapy is how much a therapist should offer interpretation. I've actually read one account in which it suggested that any attempt to interpret for the patient is an example of countertransference or projection of your own feelings onto the patient's situation. I get the impression from you you're more willing to risk countertransference, to throw yourself into the situation and see what happens.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think if the relationship is working, and that you're both working together to create the relationship, then any single statement that one makes or doesn't make to the patient isn't going to turn the whole course of therapy. I'm much more willing to take chances. Otherwise, you get caught into a kind of a eggshell approach to therapy and so careful to word everything in precisely the right way. I think I'm more willing to stumble and bumble through with patients as long as I can acknowledge things that I said that perhaps I'm sorry that I said or didn't feel that they perhaps were correct.
Well, a lot of therapists, I think, tend to take a very different attitude, that the dignity of the therapist, the magic of the idea that what's going on is important. It's almost as if perhaps they hide behind that, or they use it in a almost mystical way to motivate their clients. And I guess in your work you're trying to break down those kinds of illusions.
Yeah, I absolutely do feel that way. I'm willing to share with the patient what I know and what I don't know. That's something I've felt was important as long as I can remember doing therapy. For example, for years in my therapy groups, I've made a practice of, after each group therapy session, dictating and having transcribed a long summary of the therapy group meeting, and then mail that out to the patients before the next meeting. So they have a pretty good view of how I saw therapy, how I saw the group, the things that I wished I had said but didn't, or the things that I did say and wished I hadn't. And all the various views that I had of the group. And these summaries, I think, if patients from time to time will read over a few months at a time, I think give a good running commentary on the progress and process of therapy of themselves and as well as the development of the group. So that's something I've done for a long period of time, as well as that when I have had observers in therapy, say at a therapy group. I've often trained my students in group therapy. One of the most important things for them to do is to watch someone who's an experienced therapist do therapy, do a group. But then I'll often, rather than simply have these therapists view from a one-way mirror and the patients never see them, I find it very useful if I can bring them in at the end. And one thing I've done is perhaps have the patients just switch chairs. So they go into the observation room and listen to our discussion afterwards, or have the patients in an outer circle listening to the discussion of that. That's often very highly engaging and stimulating for patients.
So you're willing to treat your patients as colleagues.
That's right. I think it's important to demystify therapy. And I think therapy is powerful enough as it is, without our needing to add something that deliberately mystifies. And I think the more that we know, the less necessary it is to do that. Back in the 19th century, of course, we always wrote our prescriptions in Latin and kept the patient ignorant of many of our things that we were doing, almost as a way of concealing our ignorance.
Let me come back to the issue of counter-transference, or dealing with the therapist's own psychological baggage. You've described an interesting case in Love's Executioner of a woman who came to you who was obese and wanted to lose weight, and you pointed out that you yourself had a very marked, pronounced prejudice against fat women.
Yeah.
And yet you took on the case. I wonder if you could tell me what some of your motivation was there.
Well, that's a story called The Fat Lady, and I've been excoriated for that story ever since the book was published, really. Of all the parts of that book, that's the one that's had the most attention. But it is a story of a woman, not just an obese woman, but this is a woman who was very, very morbidly obese, extremely heavy. And it is true that I did have some negative feeling about in a sense, women who looked like that. And so I started off being aware of that kind of negative set that I had towards the patient. And in fact, the story is a story of a gradual transformation, not only in the patient, but in my own attitudes, so that as therapy progressed, I was able to allow her to, in my own eyes, to sort of rehumanize herself, to be able to see her in the struggling person underneath the weight. And so I meant the story to be a kind of a parallel story, not only of her struggles, but of my struggles as well.
Most of your stories are this way.
That's right, yeah, and I think hers is perhaps the most marked one and dramatic one in that way.
Other therapists would say if you knew you had a prejudice against this type of a person, you should not have taken the case.
Well, yes, and other therapists have said that, but I just have a great doubt whether therapists who don't have any of those feelings really exist. I think that we all have various feelings and attitudes towards people that we have to find ways of working through. And if we work it through with this particular patient who, in a sense, I was a spokesman for much of our culture with this particular patient, because the kind of prejudice that she may have encountered in me is very, very omnipresent in culture at large. So what better way, perhaps, to reproduce the kind of cultural struggles than to bring it into this very room? And the fact that I had these feelings about her, I think, was a way of treating her more humanly than not to tap into feelings which may have been there, but I wouldn't be willing to work with.
Well, I get the sense in virtually all of the cases that you've written about that the early sessions are ones in which your own barriers come up and their barriers are up as well, and you don't see each other in a heart-to-heart kind of fashion. You see each other in terms of your images or stereotypes.
Yeah.
And then as you get to know each other, these break down and something real happens. Two very different people emerge.
That's right. Yeah, all the stories in the book Love's Executioner, I do think, start that way. It goes without saying, of course, that I've done a lot of condensation, or I've taken a patient, say, a year of therapy, and I've sort of said, if we just sort of frame it or mat it in this way and look at this part of it, there's a good story in there. So I've written about that without including much of the everyday bread and butter work that goes on in therapy, which really don't make for a good dramatic story.
Right. Well, you've written a bestseller, and it takes some doing, I suppose, to translate real psychotherapy into good literature.
Yeah. So I've tried to be as faithful as I could to psychotherapy, but at the same time wanting to have something that was dramatically exciting and creative. So there's been a compromise in there. Yes, there is some fiction, obviously. Many of these cases were treated years ago. The dialogue, of course, is absolutely fictional.
One of the issues that you talk about is your own, I guess the best word would be hubris. You know, the idea that you have, and many therapists have, I've certainly experienced it myself, sort of like I can treat anybody.
That's right, yeah.
I just have to kind of be myself with them, and it's all going to work out no matter what mistakes I make.
That's right. And then sometimes you come against the hard facts that some people are extremely difficult to work with, and the fact that they've worked with many other therapists tells you something, that the chances are that you're going to be another therapist who can't succeed with them. So in one of the stories, the title story of that story called Love's Executioner, that was exactly the case, where I I began to be a little grandiose, and I began to dismiss the fact that she had worked with many therapists by reminding myself that these were all student therapists, and that I had a very good idea about what I thought was behind a lot of her symptoms. And in the long run was brought up short, I think, for some of the hubris that I had.
Your theoretical perspective in psychotherapy, I guess it'd be fair to call you an existential therapist.
I'm always a little uncomfortable with that title because it does suggest that there is a structured body of thought that really governs the choices that I make in therapy from the very beginning on, where that I don't think is the case. And that's why it's very, you don't see institutes of existential therapy, because it's not so much a separate doctrine as it is an accent in therapy, that you're willing to look at certain issues. But all of these, I think, have to be superimposed on a good, solid, traditional approach to psychotherapy.
But it sounds like, as I read your work, one of your premises is that underneath the symptoms are existential issues, people afraid of dealing with aging and death and alienation, loneliness, these sorts of things, and the symptoms often just distract us from the real existential issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that very strongly, and it has to do, of course, with what one's explanatory system is about the sources of anxiety. So that, as you're saying, quite frequently, I think underlying the symptoms, the initial problems that people bring into to therapy, that there are sources of anxiety which may come from these existential issues, from issues that we all have to face in our lives that have to do simply with our very being. And these are the idea that we're all finite, that all of us have to face death, and that this stimulates a tremendous amount of anxiety for all of us. It's something we work through all our lives, and other issues having to do with existence, including isolation and freedom, or the lack of structure really that exists in our lives and in reality, as well as our sort of endless search for meaning in life. I think all of these are important sources of anxiety that often are overlooked in more traditional approaches to therapy. But sometimes there are other kinds of issues that generate anxiety, having to do with relationships, having to do with sexuality. So I don't want to look at the patient in an exclusive manner. That's why I say it's a posture, it's an accent in therapy.
One of the directions that I think that this seems to lead you into is to look at present-day issues pretty much, rather than exploring a lot of childhood issues.
That's right. I do feel that it is much more important to look at the here and now, and that's for both individual and in group therapy. Sometimes it is very important to get an idea of the patient's sense of development, but very frequently I feel that patients and therapists may spend countless hours rummaging through the past. Not that the time is wasted. I think it may be very valuable time, but it's valuable not for the content of what's unearthed, but it's valuable because the therapist and the patient both value this particular task, so it acts as glue or cement to keep them bound together for what really will ultimately be the healing aspect of psychotherapy, and that is the relationship between the two.
That's important.
That's always important, yeah.
That's where you see change coming, right out of the relationship.
Yeah, I do that, and I focus very heavily on the relationship with every single patient that I work with. In fact, I hardly like to have an hour go by with a patient without at some point turning the attention back to taking a look at the process that's gone on between the two of us. In fact, it's almost automatic for me that at some point during the session, sometimes even it may just be the last few minutes of the session, that I'll stop and say, can we look for a few minutes about how you feel that we've been working together today? What were special issues about our relationship or about me that passed through your mind? But most of my patients are so used to this happening that it comes up fairly automatically.
And I am under the impression that many therapists will be quite threatened by this. They don't want to know.
Sometimes that happens, but if you know, it's almost like with any other kind of particular approach in therapy. If you deal with this long enough, then all the possible untoward kinds of crises have already occurred in your practice, so you're kind of used to that. I'm thinking of you know, a patient that I saw this afternoon, and it was difficult for her to speak during the session. I've seen her only for about 3 or 4 months, and she had a strong sense of that she was going to somehow fail, that she was a therapist and she had read some books I had written, so she was quite intimidated by me, and she knew that I wanted to work in the here and now, but she just felt she didn't know how to do that. So we spent some time looking at that, and then we talked some more about her intimidation by me, of me. She felt that I would somehow judge her negatively. We looked at what her data was for that. We looked at some of her experiences that have occurred with other teachers or professors. We looked at her wishes that I would care for her. We looked even at her concerns that she would possibly become attached to me and then also know that I would be leaving after a period of time. So, you know, and somehow after this, things became much more real between the two of us. So, as I say, hardly an hour goes by without my somehow looking at what's going on between me and the patient.
What is it actually about the relationship that you think causes the healing? And I think when we say healing, you're talking about alleviation of symptoms.
I'm talking about alleviation of symptoms, but I'm also talking about something else. I'm also talking about their ability to relate closely to one another. I mean, I think so many of our patients may come in with this symptom or that symptom, or insomnia or phobia or something like that, but underlying so much of this are some problems that really stem from the inability to get gratification from their relationships with someone close. So that if I can really work with a patient and we are intimately relating to one another, then they begin to see, for one thing, that this can generalize to relationships outside, but they begin to see that here's someone that knows everything about them and likes, respects them, deals with them, understands them, they can be understood, they can be liked. You know, I think there's so many messages that you give to a patient about the sort of core sense of self that they have through your own person. And in a group, of course, it's through the relationship they have with so many different people. I do the same thing in the group precisely in that I'm quite explicit to the patients that our task in this group is to help each of you understand as much as you can about what goes on between you and each of the other people here in the group. And we don't need a lot of history. We don't need for detailed accounts of what happens with you in the past, or what happened with you in the past, or what happens with you with other people. Because the data will unroll right here in front of us, and that's much more accurate data than any kind of history that they will give you.
I get the impression, though, that this approach is sort of flying in the face of the dominant social trend towards the medical model in psychotherapy and the emphasis on brief psychotherapy, treat the symptom, get the patient in and out in 8 or 12 sessions, and these deeper philosophical issues are considered sort of a luxury given the economic realities.
They certainly are, and it is, of course, the economic realities, the third-party payers that are dominating the way that psychiatry frames the symptom and frames the patient. None of that, however, has the slightest bit to do with what the truth of the psychotherapeutic venture is. These are just changes and fads and fashions and economics. And I think it's a great pity, and I worry a great deal about what will happen to psychotherapy in the future, not only in terms of how psychiatry views the venture, but where the next generation of therapists will come from, where they're being trained. Certainly not in psychiatric residencies, nor in many schools of clinical schools in psychology as well, with the emphasis on behavioral and cognitive modes.
Right. let me focus again with you. Maybe we can take a cut deeper into the question of what is it that causes the healing. I get a sense from reading your works that there's something almost intangible, maybe a sense of presence or a sense of depth that results in the relationship. That it's not just that they're having a real relationship with you, they may have had other real relationships in their life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so many of the patients that I've worked with, in a sense, have had real relationships, but they've often been failed relationships in some important way or other. They've never been completely known by another person, never completely revealed themselves, never felt they've been completely understood. So many of the patients feel that they've been fraudulent in their relationships, that they've bluffed their way through life, both professionally as well as socially. So I do think that the therapeutic relationship is one in which there is the deepest possible sense of being known in one's entirety by another person. It's hard to know of other ways to put that, or how you might actually label or phrase the kind of acceptance or understanding that goes on between the patient and therapist. Some people talk about the therapist being a possibilitator, or helping the patient unfold in some way through that. Certainly, Rogers has talked about that idea of the patient sort of unfolding in the light of this full acceptance.
Mm-hmm. I get the sense from your writings that when the therapy is really working well, the person is able to get in touch with their deepest fears, their terrors, and they find that you accept that in them.
That's right.
They may even discover that you've got some of the same fears.
That's right, and in a sense that's one place where the existential accent, I think, is important. That you begin to convey to the patient that there's nothing that you're not willing to look at, to accept, or to go into. Sometimes that is particularly evident in a patient who's facing some threat to his or her own life. And working with patients who may be terribly ill, for example, there's this awful sense of isolation, of not being able to talk about one's deepest fears. If one talks about one's fears of dying, that will frighten other people or drive them away. But I think a therapist who's accustomed and willing is able to just plunge into the middle of that with patients. And for once, patients can feel they don't have to protect the other, or shield the other, or run the risk of being rejected.
Dr. Irvin Yalom, we're out of time now.
Already, okay.
It's been a pleasure being with you and sharing with you this sense of your willingness to enter into frightening, even dangerous territory with your patients. Thanks so much for being with me.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for being with us.